June 6, 1944, Omaha Beach, Normandy. The gray dawn pressed heavy against the cold Atlantic, and the surf crashed with a rhythmic ferocity that drowned out every other sound. Soldiers huddled in the landing crafts, fingers white around rifles, hearts hammering in unison with the engines of the Higgins boats. You can almost taste the salt on the wind, feel the sting of spray on your face, and sense the tension vibrating beneath the wooden floors as the first waves hit the shore. Lieutenant Colonel George Taylor of the U.S. Army's Corps of Engineers leaned over the side, binoculars sweeping the jagged coastline. "We need to move fast," he muttered, voice nearly lost in the roar. Behind him, Sergeant Robert Jenkins checked the last of the demolition charges, the metallic clink echoing as if answering a silent call to battle. The men of the 299th Engineer Combat Battalion were about to attempt something unprecedented, building a working port from nothing. Not in months, not weeks, 10 days. The morning fog revealed the skeletal outline of German fortifications. Concrete bunkers, long-range artillery, and pillboxes loomed like jagged teeth. Yet beyond the chaos of the initial landings, another quieter war was beginning. A war of logistics. Every ton of food, every crate of ammunition, every piece of heavy equipment required for the push inland depended on a harbor that didn't yet exist. And the Allies couldn't afford to wait. In the calm moments between artillery barrages, you could see the engineers unpacking strange, modular components from massive LSTs, landing ship tanks, offloaded just beyond the breakers. These were the Mulberry Harbors, brainchildren of British ingenuity, floating roadways, concrete caissons, and prefabricated piers designed to interlock like giant toys, capable of creating a fully functional port where nature had offered none. Major David Henderson, overseeing the American Assembly Sector dubbed Mulberry A, barked orders with a whistle, and the men scrambled, attaching floating pontoons, unrolling steel roadway sections, and calibrating anchor chains with meticulous care. Every motion carried the weight of urgency. Shells screamed overhead, some striking the sand with thunderous impact, sending plumes of earth into the air. Yet, amidst the chaos, the engineers worked with near-mechanical precision, each man knowing his place. Lieutenant Taylor waved at a crane operator moving a massive Phoenix caisson into position, colossal concrete blocks that would act as breakwaters. The crane groaned under the weight, steel cables straining against gravity, the operator's knuckles white on the controls. Time was the enemy. Intelligence reports suggested German reinforcements could reach Normandy within days, potentially cutting supply lines before the beachhead solidified. Every crate that couldn't reach the front lines might cost lives. And so while the infantry fought for every foot of sand, the engineers fought an equally vital battle against tides, waves, and gravity itself. You, watching from a vantage point atop a nearby bluff, could see the ingenuity unfolding. Floating roadways called whales stretched from the shallows out to anchored pontoons, forming a makeshift bridge over the water. Workers in rubber boots sloshed through the surf, connecting ramps to floating pierheads known as spuds, adjusting anchors to account for the shifting currents. The scene was chaotic yet orchestrated, a symphony of ingenuity in the heart of war. By midday, the first elements of the harbor were recognizable. It was not yet functional, but the skeleton of what could become a lifeline for thousands of men and vehicles was taking shape. Major Henderson paused, wiping sweat from his brow, surveying the scene. "If we pull this off," he muttered almost to himself, "we'll change the war." Around him, men shouted coordinates, chains rattled, and the sea foamed white beneath the repeated battering of the incoming tide. In these first hours after D-Day, the engineers were not just building a harbor, they were constructing hope. And every hammer strike, every bolt tightened, every steel plate aligned was a step toward ensuring that the Allies could hold Normandy, push inland, and eventually reclaim Europe. June 7, 1944. The morning sun cut through a thin veil of mist over Omaha Beach, illuminating the tangled chaos of landing craft, barbed wire, and churned sand. The air was thick with diesel smoke, gunpowder, and the unmistakable tang of salt. Soldiers and engineers alike moved with purpose, each man acutely aware that the next 10 days would define the success of the Normandy invasion. Lieutenant Colonel George Taylor stood on the deck of a beached LST, surveying the work ahead. "We've got daylight, high tide, and about 1 million obstacles," he muttered, eyes scanning the horizon. Sergeant Jenkins crouched nearby, fastening a steel roadway section to a floating pontoon. His fingers were raw and bleeding, but he worked methodically, like a surgeon with a patient's life in his hands. Around them, the engineers were assembling the Mulberry Harbor piece by piece, a massive puzzle where every part had to fit perfectly, or the whole structure risked collapse. The first challenge was the Phoenix caissons. These gargantuan concrete blocks, each weighing thousands of tons, had been floated across the channel from England. Now they needed to be sunk in precise positions to form the breakwater that would protect the harbor from the brutal Atlantic waves. Lieutenant Taylor directed tugboats with semaphore flags, each signal critical, each movement measured to the inch. The caissons groaned as they settled into the sand, and for a brief moment, the harbor seemed to breathe beneath the engineers' careful hands. Meanwhile, the floating roadways, nicknamed whales, were being linked. They were the lifeblood of the artificial port, allowing vehicles to roll directly from ships to the beach without sinking into the sand. Corporal Frank Malone and his team wrestled with steel sections that shifted with the tide, chains snapping occasionally with terrifying force. Malone barked orders over the wind. "Hold her steady. Don't let her twist." And somehow, under the pressure of surf and storm, the pieces came together. The engineers faced a cruel adversary in the form of the channel's unpredictable weather. On the second day, a sudden squall sent waves crashing over the partially assembled harbor. Men clung to ropes and steel ramps as the whales bucked like wild horses, and one of the Phoenix caissons tilted ominously before tugboats righted it. The danger was constant. Every misstep, every miscalculation could wash weeks of effort into the sea. Yet the engineers pressed on, driven by the knowledge that thousands of soldiers inland were counting on their success. By evening, the first elements of Mulberry A were operational enough to begin offloading light supplies. Jeeps, medical equipment, and small arms started moving from LSTs down the floating roadways, guided by engineers and infantrymen alike. Private James O'Connor, a young soldier assigned to assist with cargo, paused to glance at the massive harbor taking shape. "It's like building a city out of the ocean," he whispered to himself, awe-tinged with exhaustion. Around him, the hum of machinery, the slap of water, and the occasional crack of distant artillery created a strange rhythm, both terrifying and strangely reassuring. Every hour brought new logistical challenges. Anchors needed adjusting, ramps required reinforcement, and the sea demanded constant attention. Major Henderson moved like a conductor through the chaos, shouting commands, inspecting anchors, and checking alignment. His face was streaked with sweat and grime, but his eyes held a clarity born of urgency. The harbor had to work, and it had to work now. By the close of the second day, the Mulberry Harbor was no longer a collection of floating parts. It was a functioning port, fragile but alive. Trucks rumbled over the whales, carrying vital supplies to the front lines. Soldiers and engineers exchanged brief nods of triumph, aware that they had begun to turn the tide not just on the beach, but in the entire operation. Yet even as night fell, the engineers knew the hardest work was still ahead. The next storms, the next tides, and the inevitable German counterattacks would test every seam, every joint, every man's resolve. June 8, 1944. Just past midnight, a stiff wind whipped across the channel, rattling the steel ramps and sending salt spray over the makeshift harbor. The full moon glinted off the surface of the water, illuminating the silhouettes of massive Phoenix caissons, anchored like sleeping giants against the restless tide. Lieutenant Colonel George Taylor stood on the beach, trench coat pulled tight, binoculars scanning the dark horizon. Every wave that crashed against the breakwater was a reminder. Nature was an enemy just as formidable as any German soldier. The engineers were already hard at work, even under the faint glow of lanterns and flares. Corporal Frank Malone led a small team along the whales, tightening bolts and inspecting joints. The tide had shifted overnight, twisting some of the floating roadways at odd angles. "If we don't fix this now," Malone muttered, "half this harbor could be useless by sunrise." The men worked in near silence, listening to the eerie moan of chains under strain and the distant rumble of artillery from inland. Every sound carried weight. Every misstep could sink tons of steel into the cold Atlantic. Major David Henderson coordinated the placement of additional spud pierheads, which were essential for docking the first wave of larger cargo ships. Each pierhead required careful adjustment. Too high or too low, and vehicles rolling off the ramps could be trapped or overturned. Engineers waded into the surf, guiding chains and ropes with precision born of hours of repetition, hands raw from rope burns, boots slick with seawater. The tension was palpable. The wind snapped ropes like bowstrings, waves battered steel, and yet they persisted. By midday, the first supply ships approached. LSTs groaned as they nudged against the floating pierheads. Soldiers jumped onto ramps, securing lines and guiding vehicles off the decks. Private James O'Connor, now drenched from chest-deep water, shouted orders to drivers maneuvering jeeps down the whales. Every successful unload felt like a small victory, a tangible proof that the engineer's vision was taking shape against the merciless sea. But the harbor was far from secure. Waves, wind, and the shifting sand beneath the caissons constantly threatened its stability. Lieutenant Taylor barked over a megaphone, coordinating tugboats repositioning the massive Phoenix blocks. "Hold her steady. Brace the anchors." "That's it." Each block was a tonnage nightmare, hundreds of tons moving only with brute force and precision teamwork. Men leaned into the wind, muscles straining as steel cables groaned and snapped under pressure. By late afternoon, storm clouds gathered ominously on the horizon. Engineers and soldiers alike glanced upward, knowing that a bad storm could tear apart weeks of work in hours. Major Henderson moved along the whales, inspecting every joint, every chain, every connection, his mind racing through contingency plans. "We've come too far to lose this now," he murmured to a young sergeant beside him. The sergeant simply nodded, eyes fixed on the swelling waves. Despite the constant threat, the harbor continued to function. Trucks carried ammunition, food, and medical supplies over the whales, while tugboats held the Phoenix caissons against the surging tide. Engineers performed repairs almost in real time, wading chest-deep into frigid water to reattach floating roadways and adjust anchors. Each success was a delicate triumph, proof of human ingenuity pitted against both nature and war. As night fell, the first real sense of accomplishment began to settle over the weary men. Mulberry was alive. It could bear the weight of trucks, tanks, and troops. It was fragile, yes, but it was working. Lieutenant Colonel Taylor allowed himself a brief moment to watch the illuminated harbor, reflecting like molten steel on the restless water. Somewhere in the distance, artillery fired, shells screaming over the beach. But here, on this fragile artificial port, humanity's triumph over chaos was tangible. The coming days would test endurance, engineering, and courage. Every man knew the storm was only the beginning, and the real battle to keep the supply line open had only just begun. June 9, 1944. Dawn broke over Omaha Beach with a brittle, silver light that barely warmed the soaked sand. The sea, restless through the night, had settled into a deceptive calm, and the engineers took advantage of the lull. From the horizon, massive silhouettes appeared. Liberty ships, LSTs, and tankers rolling in with a tide of steel and supplies. Lieutenant Colonel George Taylor scanned the incoming fleet through a pair of rain-specked binoculars, heart hammering. "This is it," he muttered. "The big ones." Major David Henderson paced along the whales, overseeing the docking of the first cargo giants. The pierheads groaned under the weight of approaching vessels, and engineers shouted over the wind, guiding ropes and chains with frantic precision. Sergeant Jenkins, soaked to the waist, wrestled a mooring line into place. "Easy, easy," he yelled, sweat and seawater mingling on his brow. The Liberty ships were enormous, over 400 feet long, each carrying thousands of tons of vehicles, ammunition, and rations. Every successful docking was a minor miracle. Corporal Frank Malone directed the offloading of Sherman tanks, watching them roll gingerly down the floating roadways, their treads clanking against steel plates. Private James O'Connor guided jeeps alongside, shouting directions as tanks loomed overhead like mechanical predators. The harbor was alive with motion, a dance of metal, water, and human determination. Every cable secured, every ramp aligned was a step toward survival for soldiers inland fighting for every mile. Yet danger was never far. Recon planes had spotted German artillery positions along the cliffs, and intermittent shelling reminded everyone of the stakes. One round landed too close to a spud pierhead, sending a geyser of water and sand skyward. Engineers leapt into action, wading through knee-deep water to inspect damage and make emergency repairs. Each man moved with urgency, sweat, fear, and adrenaline fueling every step. By mid-morning, the harbor's capacity was being tested. Trucks rumbled along the whales, carrying ammunition, fuel, and food to the front lines. Crates slid down ramps, chains rattling, as soldiers balanced them against the sway of the pontoons. Lieutenant Taylor barked orders to tugboats, adjusting caissons that had shifted slightly overnight. The work was relentless, requiring every ounce of muscle and mind. The arrival of the heaviest ships brought a new challenge: distributing weight across the fragile floating infrastructure. Engineers measured angles, adjusted supports, and reinforced roadway sections with steel beams. If one section fails, Major Henderson warned, the whole chain reaction could be catastrophic. Men moved like ants across the whales, balancing, tightening, checking each connection repeatedly. By evening, the artificial port had fully taken shape. The first waves of heavy equipment had reached the beach. Sherman tanks and jeeps rumbled across the whales, and trucks delivered artillery shells to the front. The scale of achievement was staggering. A functioning harbor built entirely from modular components in a place where nature had offered no harbor at all. Lieutenant Colonel Taylor allowed himself a rare smile, watching the fleet unload as dusk settled. Waves lapping rhythmically against steel caissons, yet the engineers knew the coming days would test them even further. Storms loomed in weather reports, tides shifted unpredictably, and enemy fire could strike at any moment. Still, Mulberry A had proven its worth. In 10 days or less, an artificial harbor capable of sustaining the invasion's momentum was now a living, breathing machine. And as the first trucks carried supplies inland, one thing became clear. D-Day was only the beginning, but the engineers had given the Allies a chance to turn that beginning into victory. June 11, 1944. The morning air carried a sharp, biting chill as gray clouds rolled in over Omaha Beach. The engineers moved with urgency, knowing that nature's next test was coming. Waves that had once lapped gently now slapped against the Phoenix caissons with mounting fury, sending sheets of salt water over the whales. Lieutenant Colonel George Taylor stood atop a sand dune, binoculars trained on the horizon scanning the swelling swell. "Brace yourselves," he muttered, his voice barely audible over the wind. "This is going to get rough." Inside the harbor, Major David Henderson barked orders as men scrambled to reinforce weak points. Spud pierheads creaked ominously under the relentless pressure of the surf, while floating roadways twisted slightly with each powerful wave. Sergeant Jenkins and his crew waded knee-deep in icy water, tightening bolts and chaining pontoons together. "Hold it steady," Jenkins shouted as a rogue wave lifted a section of roadway like it was made of cardboard. Every movement was a battle against physics itself. Storms were not just an inconvenience, they were a potential disaster. Engineers measured tidal surges, adjusting anchor chains and repositioning caissons with painstaking precision. Each Phoenix block weighed thousands of tons. If one shifted, it could rip apart a section of the harbor. Lieutenant Taylor signaled tugboats to reposition several blocks, the engines straining against wind and current. Sparks flew from metal rubbing against metal, and the men worked with their muscles burning, sweat mingling with rain. Amid the chaos, life went on. Trucks continued to roll across the whales, carrying critical supplies to front lines that couldn't wait. Corporal Frank Malone guided a convoy of jeeps, shouting directions over the roar of wind and surf. Private James O'Connor clung to the side of a ramp as a gust threatened to throw him into the churning water. Every successful crossing was a testament to human ingenuity and sheer stubbornness. By mid-afternoon, the storm reached full force. Waves towered over the caissons, battering the harbor with relentless ferocity. Engineers fought to keep floating roadways aligned, ropes snapping, steel bending under pressure. Henderson moved among them like a general on a battlefield, shouting instructions, encouraging exhausted men, and making split-second decisions to prevent structural failure. The harbor groaned under the assault, but it held. Night fell with no relief. Rain lashed down. Visibility dropped to near zero, and the engineers continued their vigil. Small fires burned in lanterns, casting shadows across drenched faces. Men huddled for brief moments of rest between furious bursts of activity, knowing that one lapse could undo everything. Taylor walked along the beach, boots sinking into wet sand, listening to the creak of steel and the roar of the ocean. Despite exhaustion, despite fear, he could see the harbor surviving against the odds. By dawn on June 12th, the storm had passed, leaving the Mulberry Harbor battered but intact. Trucks rolled once again along the Wales, supplies reaching troops inland. Engineers patched weakened joints, repositioned displaced caissons, and prepared for the inevitable next assault, be it from weather or enemy action. The 10-day effort to build a functioning port had not only succeeded, but it had endured a trial by nature that few could have imagined. June 13, 1944. The morning sun barely broke through the lingering clouds, glinting off the wet steel of Mulberry Harbor, though battered by the storm, had become the heartbeat of the Normandy invasion. Trucks, tanks, and jeeps rolled steadily across the Wales, carrying ammunition, food, and medical supplies to a front that stretched inland and depended entirely on this artificial lifeline. Lieutenant Colonel George Taylor moved among the engineers, his trench coat streaked with salt water, eyes sharp for any signs of weakness in the structure. Major David Henderson coordinated repairs and reinforcements with military precision. Engineers were stationed at every critical point, checking anchor chains, securing floating roadways, and inspecting the Phoenix caissons for cracks or shifts. Sergeant Jenkins directed a crew wrestling with a section of roadway twisted by the previous storm. "That's it, hold her," he shouted, muscles straining as he levered the steel into place. Around them, the air was filled with the metallic clang of tools, the hiss of hydraulic equipment, and the ceaseless roar of the channel. The engineers now faced a new challenge: enemy reconnaissance and sabotage. German planes occasionally strafed the beach and harbor, forcing crews to duck for cover while still managing vital repairs. Anti-aircraft guns fired from the cliffs, creating a staccato of fire and smoke against the overcast sky. Every movement had to be calculated. One wrong step, one misaligned ramp, could halt the flow of supplies and endanger the troops fighting inland. Corporal Frank Malone and his men worked tirelessly, guiding vehicles over the Wales while simultaneously shoring up weak points in the roadway. Private James O'Connor assisted with fuel barrels, carefully sliding them into waiting trucks. Each successful crossing was a small victory, a testament to the precision and discipline of men who had learned to operate in chaos. Every nail, every bolt, every tightened chain was a step toward sustaining the Allied push through Normandy. By mid-afternoon, the first major convoy of armored vehicles rolled directly from LSTs onto the beach. Sherman tanks, half-tracks, and jeeps rumbled over the Wales, their weight causing the floating roadways to shudder. Engineers ran alongside, adjusting supports and guiding drivers, shouting directions over the wind and surf. Lieutenant Taylor barked orders to reposition caissons that had shifted slightly overnight, ensuring that the breakwater remained aligned against the unpredictable tides. Even as the harbor functioned at full capacity, the men knew vigilance could not waver. Every anchor, every roadway section, and every caisson needed constant monitoring. The Mulberry Harbor was more than steel and concrete. It was a fragile lifeline connecting the chaos of battle on the beaches to the advancing Allied forces inland. The work was exhausting, dangerous, and relentless, but it was essential. As dusk fell, a sense of cautious pride settled over the engineers. The port was operational, resilient, and capable of sustaining the invasion. Lieutenant Colonel Taylor allowed himself a rare moment of quiet reflection, watching trucks and tanks disappear along the Wales into the gray horizon. Every man who had fought against wind, wave, and enemy fire had played a part in something extraordinary. For the first time, the idea that 10 days could change the course of a war didn't feel impossible. It felt real. June 14, 1944. Dawn arrived pale and hesitant, casting a muted light over the expanse of sand, steel, and water that was Mulberry from above. The harbor resembled a massive mechanical organism, its arteries the Wales carrying trucks, jeeps, and tanks from the LSTs to the beach. Lieutenant Colonel George Taylor stood on a dune, binoculars trained on the flow of vehicles. The port had become more than a structure. It was a strategic artery, delivering everything necessary for the Allied push into France. Major David Henderson moved among the engineers, inspecting every section of roadway and pierhead. The previous storms had left scars, slight twists in the Wales, anchors under strain, and caissons with minor cracks. Yet despite the damage, the harbor held firm. Henderson barked instructions with calm authority, repositioning tugboats, securing chains, and guiding repair crews through the logistical ballet that kept the port alive. Every correction was a silent testament to human ingenuity and determination. The 1st Armored Divisions relied on Mulberry A now more than ever. Sherman tanks rumbled down the floating roadways, their tracks clanging against steel plates while half-tracks and jeeps carried troops and supplies inland. Corporal Frank Malone ran alongside, directing traffic and reinforcing vulnerable sections with additional chains. Private James O'Connor assisted engineers in stabilizing ramps and loading fuel barrels, sweat and salt water streaking his face. Every crossing was a small victory, a tangible proof of the harbor's life-saving role. But Mulberry A was not invulnerable. German reconnaissance planes circled occasionally, and artillery fire from inland reminded the men that danger was always near. Each strike could halt operations or damage the fragile infrastructure. The engineers responded with a combination of speed, skill, and courage, patching holes, adjusting anchors, and bracing roadway sections against the relentless tide. The work was exhausting, yet every repaired joint meant that vital supplies reached soldiers fighting for every mile of Normandy. By midday, the harbor's impact was unmistakable. Trucks carrying ammunition, medical supplies, and rations streamed inland. Tanks rolled off LSTs and onto the whales, moving seamlessly toward the front lines. Engineers worked tirelessly alongside soldiers, a blur of motion across steel and sand. The harbor had become more than an artificial port. It was a battlefield enabler, a lifeline ensuring that the Allies could maintain momentum despite enemy resistance. As evening fell, Lieutenant Colonel Taylor allowed himself a rare glance at the horizon. The harbor, battered but unbroken, reflected in the gray waters alive with movement. Major Henderson and his team continued inspections, making minor adjustments and securing weak points. Every man knew that the port's survival was not guaranteed, yet in its functionality, they saw proof that meticulous planning, teamwork, and sheer determination could bend the natural world and the chaos of war to their will. The 10 days of relentless construction, repair, and adaptation had transformed a section of the Normandy coast into an operational marvel. From concept to execution, Mulberry A was now the beating heart of the Allied invasion, carrying men, machines, and hope deeper into occupied France. The harbor had not only survived storms and enemy fire, it had changed the nature of the battle itself. June 16, 1944. The sun rose weakly over Omaha Beach, casting pale light across a harbor alive with motion. Mulberry A had become an unstoppable artery of war. Trucks carrying ammunition, tanks rolling onto the beach, and jeeps darting with medical supplies transformed the coastline into a bustling hub of activity. Lieutenant Colonel George Taylor walked along the whales, boots squelching in sand and seawater, eyes scanning the operation with a quiet pride. Every bolt, every anchor, every Phoenix caisson told a story of human ingenuity, battling against impossible odds. Major David Henderson moved among the men, offering praise where it was due and precise instructions where it was not. Engineers, exhausted yet resolute, reinforced roadway sections, secured chains, and guided the offloading of yet another convoy of supplies. Sergeant Jenkins barked orders over the roar of surf and engines, directing workers as they corrected minor shifts in the pier heads caused by tidal forces. The chaos of war had become a rhythm, and every man knew his role in the delicate balance keeping the harbor alive. From above, the scale of Mulberry A was staggering. Floating roadways stretched into the surf like metallic snakes, Phoenix caissons anchored against the waves, and spud pierheads bobbed in perfect unison. Private James O'Connor, now calloused and weathered from nearly 10 days of relentless work, watched tanks roll past and whispered to himself, "We actually did it." The harbor was no longer a collection of modular parts. It was a lifeline, a machine of war that defied nature itself. The harbor's success carried immediate consequences. Supplies reached front lines faster than ever before. Artillery and tanks could move inland without delay, and reinforcements poured onto Normandy's beaches with unprecedented efficiency. Engineers worked tirelessly, knowing that their labor directly saved lives and maintained momentum in a battle that could decide the war in Europe. Every menial task, tightening a bolt, adjusting a roadway, shoring up a caisson, was part of a monumental achievement. By late afternoon, the first of the storm-damaged sections had been fully repaired. Mulberry A was operating at near maximum capacity, resilient against the tides and ready to withstand whatever the sea and enemy forces could throw at it next. Lieutenant Colonel Taylor allowed himself a moment to survey the scene. Soldiers moved with purpose, trucks rumbled over the whales, and the harbor functioned as if it had always been there, a triumph of planning, engineering, and human endurance. In the weeks and months that followed, Mulberry A continued to serve as a critical lifeline for the Allied invasion. The port allowed the Allies to pour men, tanks, and supplies into Normandy, sustaining the momentum that would eventually liberate France. It stood as a testament not just to engineering brilliance, but to the determination, courage, and resilience of those who built it. As the sun set over Omaha Beach that evening, the harbor reflected a golden light, waves lapping calmly against its steel and concrete bones. The 10-day race against time, tide, and storm had been won. In the chaos of D-Day and the aftermath of battle, the Mulberry Harbor stood as a symbol that even in the midst of war, human ingenuity could carve order from chaos and hope from the relentless fury of nature.